Hello, my name is Shaul Bassi. I work at Foscari University of Venice and I direct the Center for the Humanities and Social Change. And I'm very happy to welcome Bernardine Evaristo and Maaza Mengiste to the third edition of Afropean Bridges. Afropean Bridges is an international workshop that started in 2017 and is focused on the identity of Europeans of African heritage and on the post-colonial relationship between European and African countries. We aim at offering an alternative perspective to misleading cliches and portrayals about Afro-Europeans and Africans, especially those related to migration, poverty, development, human rights. Afropean Bridges is organized by Foscari University of Venice and in support of the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent 2015-2024. And I also want to acknowledge the contribution of Vittorio Longhi and Ijaba Shego, who are the co-organizers. And in a way, we would have loved to have Ijaba Shego, one of the most prominent Afro-European and African-Italian intellectuals, to be here as part of this conversation. But that was not possible. So I'm going to ask some of the questions that she raised. So we are combining questions that come from the different organizers. Our guests need no introduction. There are two very well-known writers. Bernardine Evaristo is a British writer, who's won many awards. She's the author of 8 books and spanning the genres of novels, poetry, verse, fiction, short fiction, essays, literary criticism, radio and theater drama. She's also professor of creative writing at Brunel University in London and has multiple projects based on African diaspora and African culture and writing. She's contributed to many, many important publications and media, and her books have been translated into nearly 40 languages, including, of course, Italian. She has a mixed background from Nigeria and England, and that's a very important part of our conversation today. And she lives in London, and I think she's speaking from London. We welcome her. Welcome very much, Bernardine Evaristo. Of course, her recent and latest novel, Girl, Woman, Other, is going to be a prominent feature of our conversation. Speaking from New York, Maaza Mengiste, novelist, essayist, born in Ethiopia. She is also an award-winning novelist that combines history and literature in her 2 novels, Beneath the Lion's Gaze and most recently, The Shadow King. And again, this is going to be part of the conversation. I could say many more things about both of you, but I think it's better if we just dive into the conversation. And I want to read a quick quote from a book from a colleague of yours, Johnny Pitts, and his book, Afropean. Johnny Pitts was a guest at Afropean, our last edition of Afropean, and where he talks about, and he glosses this word. When I first heard it, it encouraged me to think of myself as whole and unhyphenated, Afropean. Here was a space where Blackness was taking part in shaping European identity at large. Labels are invariably problematic, often provocative, but at their best, they can sing something into visibility. And I think that both Bernardine Evaristo and Maaza Mengiste's works have sung a lot of parts of the Afro-European connection into visibility. So I would like to start by asking you a kind of response to this label, Afropean, especially because you are seeing it from 2 very important but slightly eccentric perspectives. So the Black British perspective, that in a way is the most important Afro-European component, and Maaza Mengiste, who is talking from an American perspective. And so Afropean, what does the word Afropean suggest to you, Bernardine?
Oh, okay. So yes, Johnny Pitts' book Afropean is such an incredible book, actually, because it's the first book of its kind, as far as I know, and took 10 years to write. And he really is digging out all those Black communities in Europe. And one of the most interesting things about the book is that it makes you realize how disconnected we in Britain are from Europe. Black people in Britain are disconnected from Black Europeans. And we pretty much always have been. We've always turned to America for inspiration, for our role models, for the literature that inspires us. And actually, Europe is so close to us, but there is an issue of language, of course, and also translation. But our identity is very, if anything, it is very American focused, and we've kind of ignored Europe. And it's really interesting that, you know, the idea of being Afropean is not something that has been taken up yet, and it may be in the future. But I think most people, I think of Black people, will say that if they say that they're British, they'll say that they're European, but they won't necessarily put the Afro spin on it. My personal experience is that I have done a lot of traveling actually over Europe by car. And also one of my books, Soul Tourists, in a sense is an Afropean book, but I wouldn't have given it that label. Soul Tourists I published it in 2005, and there are two characters, a man and a woman, and it's in the late 1980s, and they travel across Europe by car, and it's about their relationship. But it's also about ghosts of color from European history who appear before the man in the relationship. So there are all these European figures, such as Pushkin and Alessandro de' Medici, and Mary Seacole, and the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and even Hannibal. So all these real historical figures who have lived in Europe, Hannibal going back, I think, 2,500 years, materialize in his life in this story. And it's about trying to get him to have more of a sense of belonging of the continent. And it kind of is effective. But I was so interested when I explored Black Europe, which I began to do probably about 25 years ago or even before, with books by somebody called J.A. Rogers. I don't know if you've heard of him, but J.A. Rogers was a self-taught kind of historian who did a lot of field work looking into Black history and Black European history. And also Ivan van Sertima, who was also somebody who was doing something similar. And their books may not be as academically rigorous as they need to be, but they are both, you know, the various books that they've written, especially J.A. Rogers, they're kind of a real investigation of Europe as a place that has always been occupied by people of color. And of course it has, because if you look at the European coastline, I mean, it's ridiculous to think that European history is not also rooted in Black history, because you've got Africa and then you've got Southern Europe, right? And we know that, for example, that the Moors occupied Spain for 800 years. So Spain was colonized by the Moors for 800 years. So European history and European identity, as it has been presented to us, has been very white. It's the same as British history. It's presented as very white and essentially monocultural, which is nonsense, because people of color have always lived and spread and traveled and had children together. Miscegenation would have been rife and so on through the ages, and also going through to the Middle East and going through to Asia. So the idea of Afropean as a separate identity that is claiming itself in Europe is very interesting and very pertinent. But the identity of Europe, in terms of its history, is actually much more multicultural than we have been led to believe. And one of my books, The Emperor's Babe, is about a Black girl who grows up in Roman London 1,800 years ago, right? So it's positioning a Black character in Roman Britain, and there were Black people in Roman Britain. And in the same way, there were many Black people in the Roman Empire and in Rome as such. So that the labels serve a purpose for a time, and these labels are always ephemeral in a way, because in my lifetime, half caste, I'm mixed race, so half caste. Actually, am I mixed race or am I biracial? Right. Anyway, it was half caste when I was growing up, and that was acceptable. And then it was mixed race, and now sometimes it's biracial, and maybe there are even other terms. And when my father came to Britain in 1949 from Nigeria, he was Negro, right? And he came into a coloured society, which is now a black society. And my feeling about the labels is that I just go with the flow, you know? I go with the flow. And new labels will come and go, and I'll go with the flow.
Thank you so much. So, Maaza, can you give us your perspective?
Well, I really have I'm really appreciating everything that you're saying, Bernardine, because it brings me to what you've been talking about is really this phenomenon of migration and mobility, and the fact that as soon as Europe landed in Africa, the Africans existed. But it was told from the lens of European history, and yet Africans have always been traveling. We've always been going back and forth over the sea, over the ocean into Europe, and I know I'm not the only one that does this. But every time I go into a museum, and Shaul, I think we've walked through museums in Venice, and I'm looking for that African face in paintings. And every time I find one, I will take a photograph, and there's a sense of an affirmation that we were here. We have always been here. And that has always felt important to me, because I didn't know that when I was an immigrant coming into the United States. You were asking, Shaul, about my sense as an American of what Afropean means. Coming into the United States, where I was surrounded by people who had never seen an African, didn't understand what Africa was or where it was. The levels of ignorance still sometimes shock me. And to be able, if my parents had not instilled in me my history, if they were not constantly, every time I said, I hate this place, if they were not telling me, well, you come from somewhere else, remember that. If I didn't have that, I think it would have really broken me. And I wonder what happens to children who don't have that to hold on to, even though that is part of their heritage as well, as descendants from the continent of Africa, as part of that diaspora. And I think there's always that inclination to find yourself wherever you go. And that's why I think the book like Afropean and your books, Bernardine, that begin to force that history into conversation with what Europe thinks is world history, which is really just European history, matters so much. And Afropean is maybe based on the European continent, but when even America has looked to Europe as a standard for history, because America is a young country, it matters that writers, intellectuals, academics are placing Africans on that continent, centuries back, millennia back. It really makes a difference to how Americans begin to speak of the African American population that's here. We don't have enough of a dialogue yet between the African American experience and the Afropean experience as a global experience. We have an American, and then we have the European. And I think that is where we need more work on that.
Thank you, Maaza. Actually, I think I want to go back to that very important point a bit later. But before I do that, let's see if I do it right. No, it's like this. I think I really want to share. It's mild frustrating. I cannot have your autographs, through the screen, but that's of course an invitation for you. This is a question that comes from Ijaba, in very different ways, but both of your wonderful novels explore the history of Blackness and as histories of resistance and histories of resilience, and especially by Black women. So can you say something like that? And again, we'll start. We'll maybe go, in this case, we'll go in sort of chronological order. We'll start from the history of anti-colonial resistance, which in the case of the Shadow King is particularly interested for us Italians, because Maaza Mengiste, with her novel, is also responding, and we look forward to the publication in Italian, to the deficit of historical memory about colonialism in Italy. So what does it mean to write about resistance from the point of view of the Black woman, Maaza, and then Will?
I think any resistance from the perspective of a woman, any woman that's involved in a liberation movement, and who is African, has to contend not only with racism but misogyny. And so there's that double layer of resistance that has to take place. The role or the definition of enemy, it becomes more complicated. That's the one thing I found very quickly when I was writing my book, is that the women who were soldiers, when they were on the front lines, they were soldiers. And when they came back into the camp, they became women again, with all of the layers of what it means to be a woman, what it means to have expectations of needing to serve the needs of the community, but also of men. And that's something that gets clouded when we speak of resistances. And I think Shaul, it's within the partigiani, the anti-fascist resistors, that there were a huge number of women, Italian women in that. And I would be interested in learning more about their experiences as women in those fights. The liberation movements across Africa have often, women have not spoken about what happens to them after they're finished fighting the enemy and come back. And this for me is what it means to fight, or to begin to render these women, because it's complicated by so many other things besides patriotism or besides a fight for national freedom.
Thank you very much. Bernardine, many of the 12 protagonists of this amazing choral novel are Black women. And in that case, we talk of a different type of resistance to different forms of mainstream oppression. Can you say something about that?
Yes, well, it's interesting, because when I was writing the book, I wasn't thinking about the women being oppressed or even necessarily the women being in struggle. I was thinking I'm going to have a diversity of Black British womanhood, and in the end, one character is non-binary, as we know, and one person you don't think she's a woman of color, but I just wanted a diversity of stories. But I think it's very difficult to do that without also exploring struggle and the ways in which these women have very, very specific lived realities according to how they present in society, according to their cultural backgrounds, according to their sexualities, their classes, their immigration status. There are so many ways in which the women in the novel, have obstacles put in front of them, and they have to somehow surmount them. Because I don't write characters who are victims, as in their personalities are not victims. People may be victims of circumstance, but I'm not interested in writing characters who are just crushed and defeated, in any of my books, in fact. So at the same time, I'm not playing into the sort of the stereotype of powerful Black women either. Right, but I just want to write fully complex, flawed, interesting characters. But all these areas of their lives do present in different ways, in different contexts, in different generations, different parts of the country, even different parts of the world, various obstacles that they have to overcome, because we are living in Britain in a white male patriarchy, essentially, right? To reduce it, to boil it down to that. So anybody who is considered to be other than that is always going to be, if they are ambitious and if they want to lead full and rich lives, they're always going to be, in a sense, in resistance to it, or in conversation with it, even if they don't know that they're in resistance to it. But this is also not a novel about suffering, right? Okay, some of the women do suffer at certain points in their lives, and some readers have assumed it is a book about suffering because I said it's a book about Black British women. It's like, oh, it's tragic. It's a tragedy. It's not a tragedy. No, it's not a tragedy. It's a comedy, actually. Some of it. you know, you know, I don't know if you feel this, Maaza, but there are all these expectations that people have when you're writing about Black women.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so even as the act of writing is a resistance, even the act of putting these stories out there into that silence that you are doing and I'm doing, we're resisting the dominant narratives, right? We're bringing our perspectives to the fore. And then we have to deal with people who, and their assumptions and expectations around that. And if we're lucky, they read the work and then they get to a different understanding of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I have to jump in, Bernardine, and let you know that when I turned in my book, I really had to fight with my editor because she kept asking me, well, couldn't Hirut, one of my main characters, a female soldier, she said, couldn't she just fall in love with an Italian? And I'm like, this is not going to happen. And just recently she said, I'm really glad you fought so hard, that you fought me on this. So there's, yeah, I mean, yeah.
It's almost as if you have to have that for the book to have value in the commercial market. Is that what she was saying, really?
Yeah. And it's very uncomfortable to not have that kind of a resolution or that kind of a forgiveness when women have decided to rise up and you know, defend themselves. But then you need this other thing to remind us that they're still women. Yeah, so it's.
Thank you so much for that, Maaza. I was going to say that would it be wise to say that you've both broken a taboo that, you know, in the case of girl, woman, other, the idea of exploring the sexuality of Black women in such a varied and diverse and open way goes against the objectification of Black women that you have in mainstream culture. And in the case of the Shadow King, the idea of violence, you know, that Black violence is always a very problematic issue. So the fact that you show, you know, women as sexual subjects on the one hand, and women as sort of, you know, fighters on the other, is in fact a breaking of certain stereotypes that are quite dominant.
Yeah, I think with Girl, Woman, Other, it was really it wasn't even okay. Objectification exists, but it was also just the silence, actually, in British literature of our lives. Now, I know most of the Black women writing novels, and we are the ones most likely to put ourselves in the center of our novels, almost without exception, right? So if there's only a handful of us writing novels, then that means there aren't going to be many representations of us, right? And typically, often a novel will have like a single, maybe Black woman protagonist. I mean, that's been the story so far. And so with me wanting to write all these multiples, I just wanted to speak to the accents, speak to the silence. And then the sexuality of the characters was really important to me, because I didn't want to make it a heteronormative novel, because that's not true to reality. And I didn't want to make any token gestures either. So it would have been perfectly acceptable if I'd have written a single lesbian character and people have thought, oh, that's really cool, you know. But actually, you know, a quarter of the women are on the queer spectrum, right? And there's a non-binary figure. So it's really their sexuality is really embedded into the fiction. And so because we are so absent from fiction anyway, and those books that are in existence are almost entirely heterosexual novels with heterosexual experiences. And my last novel, Mr. Loverman, was speaking to the Windrush generation who came to Britain in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, of people from the Caribbean who all have also almost universally been portrayed as heterosexual. So I have this older gay Caribbean man. And by the time I finished the book, I thought, why didn't I write about a lesbian? So this book is kind of like in conversation. Girl, Woman, Other is in conversation with that book, which was so much about male homosexuality of a certain age and cultural background. And so it is. So I think what I love about what's happened to my book is that these people out there the readers in Britain and elsewhere who would probably never normally pick my book up, right, are picking it up and reading it, and they're getting over themselves, right? It's a Black woman's book. Oh, it's experimental. Oh, okay. And they're reading it, and they're seeing the humanity of the characters. But what they're actually reading is a Black experimental radical text.
Yeah.
Queer inclusive text.
Yeah.
Right?
I like what you're saying, Bernardine. It makes me think about the kinds of literature that has normally been expected of Black writers, Black female writers, that we write stories of survival, and we don't necessarily, the territory of experimentation, the territory of radical imagination, those things are not for us. We write, we write these things about how we survive and not the joy of living. And to hear you speaking about all your books, it's just really, it's really refreshing, because we're not supposed to be taking leaps of the imagination. We're supposed to be writing stories about how we barely manage to get out of one world or another.
This is wonderful, and I was thinking that one of our aspirations, ambitions at Afropean Bridges is also to inspire younger and emerging Afropean authors. So could you let us have a glimpse of your creative workshop? I know a little bit about the creative process that led to The Shadow King, and so maybe I'll also like to ask Maaza about doing research work for her novel. So could you both tell us a little bit about how your these two novels came about, what went into the creative process, and also the definition of the style, because in both cases there are, I mean, especially in the case of Bernardine Evaristo, there is a radical fusion style, as Ijaba calls it in one of her questions. So tell us a little bit about how those novels came about.
Do you want to go first, Maaza?
I was just going to say, I'd love to hear Bernardine's. You beat me to it. I would love to hear your answer, please.
I'd like to hear your answer, because I suspect you did a lot more research than me.
Well, I will tell you that I did a lot of research in the beginning. I did the research that we think of in the archives, in the libraries, with stacks of books. And I did a draft of the book that way. And then when I realized that was not working, and that draft was really horrible, I needed to do something else. And I put all my research away. And I told myself that I was not going to open a book to look up any information. I was going to trust the fact that it was in my head, that I knew what I needed to know, and I would just focus on story. And I realized that the story I was telling outside of war is a story about what it means to love yourself when everything is telling you you're not worthy of that love. And what it means to stand up for yourself when people say that you're not worthy of that act of defiance. And once I figured that out, then I wanted to think about the way that my memory works, at least the way I think everybody's memory works, which is that time goes this way, but our memory is constantly going this way. Like what's past and present, what we're imagining of the future is here. We're right where we're standing, if that makes sense. Time is just moving, but memory is, everything's happening at once. And I wondered about, without like making the book convoluted, how do I do that in a book? How do I do that in structure? How do I create the way that your mind thinks of something, goes somewhere else, but it connects and comes back? And the way we often speak with different voices still echoing in our heads. And I wanted that novel to reflect that, but also inhabit this space of, in a sense, a kind of love that was not afraid to fight for it, a self-love. And so the research took a back seat, and I was in Venice, Shaul, when I wrote the last sentence of the book. I was there for a residency, and I did not bring any research books with me deliberately for that. It was here, but what was here was the story that needed to be written. So that I learned for writers that are interested in doing this kind of work. The research matters, but at some point it's really the story and what you want to write about.
Can I ask you, how long did you research before you started writing the story and just left the research to one side?
Well, I was trying to do it at the same time, which I think was part of the problem initially, but I would say like 3 or 4 years of research. I mean, I have books everywhere. I was reading everything. And then at some point I said, none of this matters. Like, none of it matters because my characters don't need to know all of this. Hiro has only gone 5 kilometers from her home. Why does she care? Like, what's happening 200 kilometers away? And that helped a lot. As soon as I centered the story on human beings and not on data. It changed everything.
It's so interesting though, isn't it? Because even though you spent so much time researching and you left it to one side, I mean, that is a really long time to research.
I'm not doing it again.
No.
I am not.
But then it's really deep inside you as well.
That's the thing.
You've really absorbed it, so you can let it go.
Yeah.
Because you know what it is. You know what the context is of the novel that you're writing.
Absolutely.
Which was a very powerful novel, by the way. I didn't
Thank
say
you.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Really, really good. So,
Brennan, let me ask you more specifically. So Girl, Woman, Other has an incredible structure, an incredible set of characters, and a very radical style. So did the style, structure, and plot, I mean, were they all there when you started writing, or did they come with the writing?
Yeah, I'm quite an intuitive writer in a sense. But when I say that, people think that you don't know what you're doing. So, and I do know what I'm doing, right? But because I've been writing for, when I started this novel, it was 2013, and I had my first produced piece of theatre that I wrote was 1982. So even though I'm intuitive, I have a really strong sense of story, and I know that, and I've written all these books, so I really know how story works. But I'm also interested in how story can work for each story that I need to tell. So I'm very open to experimentation. And with this book, I use that fusion fiction. And that was the only thing, in a way, that I had fixed, because I had used it in my previous novel, Mr. Loverman. So there are 2 characters in Mr. Loverman, a husband and wife, and the wife sections are written in this kind of fusion fiction. And I love the form, because actually when you remove full stops, you liberate language and you liberate story. It's really interesting. Do you know what I mean? Because actually, a full stop it means you stop. But if you take away the full stop, you don't stop. You just carry on writing. So it's just like, oh my gosh, it's never ending.
Oh my God. We need a whole other hour to talk about punctuation.
Yes. And so I don't use many full stops. And I just have that patterning on the page, right? So it was really liberating, and I loved it. And I knew that I could sustain a whole novel with this form, but I didn't know who the characters would be, and I didn't know the structure of the book. And it's only at a certain, because I don't really pre-plan. So at a certain point, I realized, oh, okay, so I've got mother-daughter relationships. I've got these units of 3. But that was probably towards the end of the book, because the other honest thing to say is that I forget what the process is. I've got the evidence, right, in the drafts, but I never go back to the drafts. That's for the archive. One day if anybody wants it. But I'm kind of, when I'm revisiting how I've written a book, I kind of sometimes just make things up. So because I've forgotten exactly when things happened. But that is the gist of it. So it's like, okay, I've got this form, I've got one character, I know I want lots of characters. And then one character led to another character, led to another character. And then I started to look, okay, I've got these women, they're different backgrounds, sexualities, whatever. How can I put them together? And then I realized they were all London centric. So I needed to take the novel out of London to the north of England, because that was really important. And yeah, and that's kind of how it evolved. So it sounds haphazard, but it isn't haphazard, because I know how a story works. I know the fundamentals of storytelling.
Absolutely. So basically your advice is to remove the full stop key from the keyboard, and that will go. Yeah. I wish we could continue to talk about literature, but I also feel a kind of an obligation to raise another issue that in fact has been formulated by Ijaba Shego. So 2020 has been the year of the pandemic. We've all been living through this unprecedented condition. And it also has been the year of Black Lives Matters. And the pandemic has also highlighted, as Ijaba points out, that there are some social, gender, and racial inequalities that the virus has, in a way, highlighted. So how do you see that from your respective points of view? Because I think this also ties in with what was said earlier, that Black Lives Matter is an American phenomenon that has been also seen from a European perspective as something that is very relevant, but it can also needs to be seen in context. So I know this is a kind of a complex question. So it's both about the relationship between the pandemic and perhaps racial inequality on the one hand, and also how Black Lives Matters reflects possible analogies and differences between the US and Europe.
Okay, over to you, Maaza.
I'm like, as soon as Shaul stops talking, I'm going to direct it to me. Well, you know, there's so many things to talk about. But I think I want to pick up on that last part that you said, that the Black Lives Matter movement will have special contexts, you know, in Europe as opposed to America. And I've been thinking about this. I find that when we speak about the global Black experience and we talk about an African experience around the world, we don't include the African American experience in that. I think what happens with the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's moved from America and it's gone it's gone global. But I have been thinking lately, I was watching this television series that's on HBO called Lovecraft Country. And there was a segment in there about the Oklahoma massacre, the Tulsa massacre that happened in the 1920s, I believe, when white supremacists basically destroyed a Black community that was thriving. There were Black bankers, Black doctors. Everything was there. And they massacred people, burned down that town. And this was in 1920, and I started thinking, why haven't we had this conversation about this massacre, as well as others that have happened in the United States, in connection to the German massacre of the Herero, in addition to, next to the Italian massacres in Ethiopia, connecting it to what the British did in Kenya to the Mau Mau? Why haven't we haven't put the African American experience on a continuum with a global conversation about Blackness? And with the Black Lives Matter movement, it traveled from the United States into the rest of the world, and everyone started to speak of George Floyd as a symbol of something that happens worldwide. I think we need to have more of these conversations where we place the African American experience as an international experience, not just American. And this is the thing that I've been thinking about as Black Lives Matter. The movement has been coming up, that my experience in Ethiopia under a revolution, the way that I felt as a child mirrors in ways that I couldn't comprehend necessarily until all of this started blowing up, mirrors the way that children living in certain cities in the United States, Black children feel whenever they see a police car in their neighborhoods. The pandemic has exacerbated and compounded all of that in horrifying ways. But I really hope that this is just the beginning of a global Black conversation that positions Blackness not separated by American and then European and African, but really brings it together. Which brings us right back to, I think, how this conversation started, like an hour ago.
Is it an hour? Ooh.
Sorry, Bernard.
No, it's only. Bernard, how do you see the Black Lives Matter from the?
Yeah, it was a wake-up call for this country, because we had protests with Black Lives Matter a few years ago, but not on the scale of what happened this summer. And this summer, it was particularly multiracial, which also made a difference. And it felt as if the institutions in this country were finally, some of them, not all of them, were finally starting to reflect on their own discriminatory practices and, making noises about trying to redress some of the balances that have been going on for a very long time. I mean, to the extent that the Archbishop of Canterbury, right, who is the head of the Church of England, he said in that period during Black Lives Matter, he said, we need to look at the representation of Jesus. Wow. Because Jesus didn't look like that. He was a Middle Eastern man. And we're like, yeah, we know that. He was not blonde hair and blue eyes. But the fact that the head of the Church of England was saying that was astonishing. And it was almost as if the impact of Black Lives Matter really shook some of the institutions to their core, right? Whether that will have a lasting effect will be different. But the other thing is that, so Black lives in the UK in relation to African American lives is, the situation is that people look to America. America was always the leader. America is the cultural colonial force in the world in a sense today. And so when things go wrong in America, when we have these racist incidents, and when the level of systemic racism in America is exposed, which, every so often there's something that explodes and everybody is forced to look at it in this country, it also serves to hide what goes on in Britain. So we, of course, in a majority white country, right, with Black people and Asian people, there are always going to be systemic injustices. And that is the case here. But Britain is generally in denial about it, and has been always. It's been in denial about slavery. It was the biggest slave owner in the world, slave trading nation in the world for a couple of hundred years, right? And it's always been in denial about the Black aspects of British history. And actually, Black British history is British history. There shouldn't really be a distinction. There are so many ways in which, there is systemic racism in Britain, top down, every level of society. But we don't really reach critical mass, except we did this summer. And so it's buried and it's sublimated, and people like to go around thinking it doesn't exist. And so things have come to the fore. And with the pandemic and the disproportionate number of Black and Asian people who have died from the disease, that's been an interesting conversation as well, because initially people were saying, people in authority were saying, well, maybe it's something to do with, their biology, that they're more likely to die from COVID. But then, we got past that little myth, and we started to look at who's on the front line, people in the health service. Who are the people who are going to be in more direct contact with people who are infected with the disease? And so it really did expose some of the injustices at that level as well through COVID. So yeah, lots of issues.
Lots of issues, and I want to end this conversation. And again, I wish we could stay together longer, but I know that you're very busy. At Foscari, we are now focusing in particular on the environmental humanities. So we think that we all live together in the midst of an unprecedented environmental crisis. We think that the environmental crisis is usually addressed as something that can be fixed through technology, through science. But as an eminent colleague of yours, Amitav Ghosh, has argued, the climate crisis is also a crisis of the imagination. And I think that one of the challenges for the present and the future will be really to use all the resources of literature and all the arts to try to rethink our role as inhabitants of this planet. And one of the consequences of the environmental crisis is that of ecological migrants. There's a growing community of migrants that are living not because of war, not because of poverty, but because of the consequences of sea level rise and rising temperature. So do you think that literature, Ghosh is himself kind of skeptical, self-critical, saying that maybe literature is not an adequate medium to address the magnitude of the environmental crisis. I know this is perhaps too big a question to end a conversation with little time, but do you think there is something that literature can still do to renew and reconfigure the relationship between the human and the non-human in this world?
I think there are writers. I didn't read Diane Cook's book who was one of the Booker shortlisted authors, but her book is about climate change, I think. I think writers, we're there to explore every aspect of our societies. And definitely, the environment, climate change is part of that. If you think about The Road by Cormac McCarthy, that sort of post-apocalyptic, incredibly bleak but beautiful novel, which kind of tells us, is a sort of salutary warning, if you like, about what can happen if we don't look after the planet. So yeah, that's a really big question. So I just think we can explore all things and everything through literature. And sometimes those books will have an impact and perhaps change people's minds.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. And I think that, as you said, Shaul, the literature is there to jumpstart that imagination, help us reimagine the kinds of futures that we want, and help us imagine the ways that we can make that happen. So Diane Cook's book is really a fantastic example. The Road is another one. I'm really interested in what might be coming out of different countries in Asia and in Africa about the climate change stories that are there. Like those writers that are working on those books, I would love to read. It's becoming, it has to be, and it is becoming a significant issue. It affects everything.
Well, thank you very much. We, Venice is trying to live past the pandemic, but also to reinvent itself, because it's a city that has a long history of migration, has a long history as a crossroads of civilization. As Maaza noted, there is a very rich Black archive in Venice that, in a way, embodies and symbolizes the fact that a healthy a city is a cosmopolitan city that creates a good relationship and balance between the environment, the human, and different cultures. So we are really struggling here, but we're also thinking that Venice may become a sort of laboratory, international laboratory, to think about the future and a more sustainable future. And we strongly believe that writers and intellectuals can play a key role. So let me end by thanking you very much for this very rewarding, stimulating conversation, but also by inviting you to being with us in Venice in the future and to be part of this creative effort, because I think we need a creative effort, and that also includes your perspective. So Bernardine Evaristo, Maaza Mengiste, thank you very much on behalf of Afropean Bridges, and see you in Venice before too long.
Thank you so much. It's so good to see you, Bernardine.
Yes, we should meet in person in one of our cities, right?
We will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hosting. It was great.
Thank you, Shaul.